Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn more how to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. Welcome to the Deconverters Bible Study. I do 3 different Bible studies on Tuesdays, and this one in particular is called Tongues of Fire, where I'm looking at the book of Acts and recounting how I used to look at this book and its passages as a Pentecostal and how I look at it now, and some advice to former Pentecostals on how to deconvert from some of the ideas that we used to believe, some of the things that I've gotten over the years. Today we're looking at Acts 5:17 to 42. I realized that I had kind of skipped this passage last time I touched this Bible study, and so I'm going back to it. But this is the part where basically, I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a very lengthy passage. But if I were to give a summary, this is where the part where God, they imprison the apostles for preaching and they want to talk to them later. And the apostles are basically freed miraculously. The doors come open, they are allowed to leave, and then the doors shut back again behind them. And so when the guards go to see what's, gather them for the Sanhedrin, they're not there anymore, and they're out in the temple court preaching, which I find it very weird that they didn't know that, because, they would have gone home and come back, things like that. But so there's a few plot holes in the story if you really look at it. But so they end up calling these apostles back into the Sanhedrin for more questioning. These people that they put in jail, they're out in the courts preaching to the people. So they bring the apostles in. They didn't use force because they feared the people would stone them. And then the apostle appear, and the Sanhedrin said, hey, we give you orders not to preach in this name, and yet here you are doing it. And of course, Peter gives one of his most famous replies: we ought to obey God rather than men. And it's at that point that, the story takes an interesting turn, because, Peter is very accusatory in what he says. He very boldly preaches what he perceives as the truth to them about how Jesus was killed by them, and that there's this whole narrative now of, the Jews and the apostles were the ones that, the apostles are the ones standing for truth, and the Jews and the Sanhedrin and religious leaders, kind of the old way of doing things, are persecuting them for not staying with the old faith. So once they hear Peter's word, they become furious, because Peter is very bombastic in this passage. He's very accusatory of them being murderers, basically. And that, of course, if anybody's accused of being a murderer and they don't think they are one, they're going to react very strongly. And so the Sanhedrin's reaction is pretty typical and what I would expect. And one of them, Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, gets up and says, hey, man, do you really want to continue to persecute these people? Because if you do, they're going to just get more popular, okay? And if it's of man, and he gives a couple examples of a couple probably messianic figures that came to nothing. Some of these people got 400 people following them. Look what happened. In the end result, it didn't amount to anything. Okay, so he says, listen, if this is of men, it's going to fizzle out anyway. It's going to come to nothing anyway. And if it's God, there's no way you're going to stop it. You'll only find yourself fighting against God. And to a lot of people, this is kind of good logic. So he persuaded them, and they let him go, and they just told him not to speak in the name of Jesus. They had the apostles flogged for causing them trouble. And then the apostles go out from the Sanhedrin, and they tell everybody the story, and everybody starts rejoicing because of what happened. They have this rejoicing moment where, that they get to go, yay, we got persecuted for God. All right. What are some of the things that I used to preach out of this passage as a Pentecostal preacher? What did I hear preached out of it? Well, one of the biggest things I think if there's a theme that Pentecostals preach on in this passage, is that the real church has certain qualities compared to the false one. What you hear a lot about this passage is the Sanhedrin represents the religious leaders, the dead religious leaders, that there's a difference between a true active faith and religion. Pentecostals don't have a very high view of religion, even though they are one, because they have this, they redefine it a little bit so that they can step outside of that and they know we're the true faith. and these are the religious leaders of various religions. What ends up happening there is you end up with this aspect of, okay, there's a true faith and there's a religious faith. And so what are the differentiations? Well, I heard it preached many times, well, the real church will find itself miraculously delivered in order to preach the gospel, but the false church will actually oppose the gospel. Okay, and the Sanhedrin becomes a kind of a type or an example of a false church, and the real church is the one that preaches the gospel despite opposition. Okay, the other thing you would see is the true church is not afraid of men, but will rather preach the gospel, okay, no matter what. And Peter becomes a good example of this is the boldness of what the Holy Spirit does to you. When you get filled with the Holy Spirit, you become bold for Christ, and this is something that you begin to do. And you're going to preach that regardless of where the opposition comes from, whether it comes from other religions, whether it comes from inside Christianity, from other denominations, or whether it comes from even the government. Okay, they would say if the government opposes you, you have to obey God more than you obey men. And so you always have this, where, in a sense, if I were to put it in more modern terms, the divine command theory takes precedent over any law or morality that human beings would teach. And so if God is telling you to preach the gospel, then you preach the gospel regardless of opposition. Okay, so you continue to do that. And this is one of the ways that you can tell the genuine church is from the false one. Also, they take Gamaliel's words as good words. Okay, so that if something is of man, okay, you'll hear this expression, well, that's of man or that's of God, in Pentecostal circles a lot. And most of the time it's like, well, that was obviously of man because it didn't come of anything. It didn't, produce anything. If it's of God, it'll be successful. Okay, so they take Gamaliel's word because it found its way into the Bible, okay? So there must have been something valuable in what he said, so they put it in the Bible. So the Pentecostal says, okay, the value then is if something is successful, based on whatever definition of success, people are saved, they're baptized, they're filled with the Spirit, the church continues to grow, then that's of God. If it's not of God, then it'll come to nothing. And so they'll apply that to everybody, including other churches, other denominations. That denomination is failing because it became dead, or this denomination because it's false, or this idea of God always brings success, God always brings prosperity, okay, is right there in the passage. This is where a lot of the success prosperity preachers get their narrative. And so when they stand in the pulpit in front of television, everybody, well, you can tell I'm of God because God has prospered me and God has made me successful in this ministry. I started out with this and now I have this big thing, so I must be of God. The other thing you'll see preached out of this passage is that if people are persecuted and suffering for Christ's sake, that's something to be celebrated. It's something to be, the persecution narrative, the martyr narrative continues. And so that's part of it. So with all that said, what do I say now as a former Pentecostal who no longer believes this stuff? One, I'm now firmly convinced that if you want to authenticate any story within the church, just put a miracle with it. Just throw a miracle on it, and it will instantly gain credibility. When you look at this story, for instance, what you see is because the apostles are freed miraculously, there's credibility given to the story. You will see this a lot in the book of Acts, and because of that, a lot of Pentecostal believers, did God miraculously do something for the story? And so you will see Pentecostal believers adding miracles all the time to everything because they want to add credibility to the story. Even if it's just something cool that happened, I think God was really involved in that because this little miracle happened, and so there are miracles everywhere to authenticate everything a Pentecostal does. You'll hear this narrative, and now I'm like, miracles don't happen, so what's really going on here? Well, I think a lot of times miracles are just stories that people make up to add credibility to what they're saying inside the Pentecostal church. If you have a really powerful testimony with a lot of miracles, that's going to get a lot more attention than, I just gave my life to Jesus. There's got to be this miraculous deliverance. There's got to be this miraculous change of heart. There's got to be some sort of miracle connected with the story if you want credibility inside of a Pentecostal church, because the real church has this miraculous stuff happening all the time. And so I think a lot of miraculous stories are just made up or exaggerated. Some little thing that happened in the natural world and it's exaggerated into something else that it's not. Second thing I think is I think you see a lot of Pentecostals even more rebellious and disobedient to all kinds of, including the government. I would not be surprised if there's two roads that Pentecostal churches take when it comes to the government. Either they just become an isolated community and completely ignore it, or they become Christian nationalists. I never really see Pentecostal churches going one way or the other. But to their credit, some Pentecostal churches, what do we have to do with the world? What do we have to do with Caesar? And they would rather focus on, being the church and doing what the church does. And so several, preachers have come out and said, no, we just don't need to be involved in this. But a lot of them, even that is kind of based on this idea of, we got to go about our business obeying God rather than, deal with what, the world is doing. And so there's this kind of isolationist and getting away from reality kind of interest in there. And Peter's words have often been used to justify, even within the church, well, I think you're speaking for man and I ought to obey God more than man. And so you can have this real subjective use of Peter's words to pretty much justify any act of rebellion against the authority. And so any authority can be rebelled at using Peter's words. And you see a lot of preachers say, well, I used to be part of this denomination, but I rebelled because they were obeying man and I'm obeying God. And so you can see how this could be used. This theology can be used to justify any act of rebellion, any act of disobedience, any act where you go counter to a society and just do what you want to do and justify it. I think a third thing I would say now, it's quite possible to have success and not be of God or of the truth. Okay, there's plenty of things that are successful in this world that don't have anything to do with God. And so, if it's successful, it's God. It's not successful, it's man, can really lead you down some pretty dark paths, because some cult leaders can be very successful in persuading people of what's right and convincing people, and look at how successful they are. You see this a lot in the faith preachers, because they say, look how much I've been prospered, look how much I've been built up. And I'm sorry, that doesn't mean that you're true. It doesn't mean that you're right. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't even mean what you are is of God, because I understand how psychology can be used in a mass way to manipulate and control people. So I guess I would ask, that doesn't prove anything. I think Gamaliel actually is off here. I would argue with Gamaliel. It's like, no, you can have successful things and not have them be of God. And there are some things that could fail, I suppose, and still be, very godly and right. There are plenty of good things in this world that have failed. That doesn't mean that they weren't of God or anything, or of God. Success and failure often has a lot to do with the human beings involved and whether or not people buy into something. And finally, I don't think being persecuted is always a badge of honor. And it certainly isn't related to, truth either. Sometimes you're being persecuted because you're being a jerk, and other times you're being persecuted because you're just straight up, ignorant and stubborn. From my perspective, I hear a lot of these a lot of these apologists talk about, I reacted to a couple of them recently, and of course they went into I'm being persecuted for the sake of Christ. And it's like, no, you're just being a jerk, okay? You're just not being a good human being, and people are getting after you for it, and that's kind of leading you down this path. And so, you don't have to, when Pentecostals talk this way, you don't really have to buy into their narrative. It's a lot of times they're just full of crap. And so I've gotten to the point where a lot of you come here and they watch this series. I usually hear people that have deconverted from some sort of Pentecostal path or some sort of faith that involves that. And I want to, how do I help those of you that are deconverted from this stuff? Well, I came out of this stuff, and the one thing I began to learn is that there's a very false narrative in the Pentecostal church about what is true and what is false based on A, success, and B, whether miracles are attached to it. But all this really does is create the pressure to create miracle stories. If you look back at your Pentecostal days, if you were a former Pentecostal, how many miracle stories do you think were concocted to add credibility to the person? Because Pentecostals like the whole miraculous theme, they will concoct stories and make this stuff up. Or they have a very low, or if you're a believer in the stories, you have a very low bar when it comes to proof of whether the stories are true. The moment it attaches this miracle story to it, then suddenly it gains credibility. That's not the way, if you want to really look at how credibility really is, it's when somebody puts facts and evidence behind what they say. Okay, they can demonstrate the truth of their proposition. What Pentecostals do is absolutely avoid this by saying, hey, there was a miracle, so what I said must be true. What happened to me must be true. Or I'm persecuted, and so therefore it must be true. So what this leads to, that being a kinder, gentler person can get you past the persecutor narrative. That looking at your behavior and seeing, hey, is this really helping or harming, is probably one of the best things you can do deconverting, because it helps you understand that you had this narrative that if I'm persecuted, I must be doing the right thing. No, if you're being persecuted, it might simply mean that you're being a jerk and you're not being a good human being, and you're trying to justify not being a good human being using God. And once you get rid of the God belief, it's like, okay, I can't do that anymore. And I need to really focus on my behavior, whether I'm actually being helpful, whether I'm actually doing something right. Persecution doesn't lead that way. Of course, getting rid of the miraculous stories, okay, well, now I have to have another standard of what I determine as truth. So, having evidential standards in your life, okay, if you're going to prove something to me, you better bring your evidence, you better bring your data, you better show me that this is the truth because it conforms to reality around me and it has predictive power. Okay, it proves that by showing that it has predictive power. Miracles don't do that. In fact, miracles, because I don't think they exist, are nothing more than stories that people use to authenticate stuff. And getting past all that, miracle stories should not impress you anymore. It should immediately bring in your skepticism. So whenever you hear a miracle story as a deconverted person, immediately bring your skepticism of the miracle. I think that'll help a lot. One of the things that's helped me is I get miracle stories on this channel all the time. And I'm like, citation, please, give me some evidence. Is this repeatable? Did this happen again? No. It became, it's just somebody told a story and everybody repeated the story and therefore it's true. And that's the way a lot of miracles are and miracle stories. And taking, learning how to use Occam's razor and Hume's arguments against miracles as a former Pentecostal has been bona fide for me. I had one person remark, well, Hume, you wouldn't be able to prove anything under Hume. No, Hume is very targeted on miracles. To him, the natural world is something that's proven, okay? And therefore, to him, a miracle is a suspension of the natural order, okay? So that implies that he very much believes in the natural order of things. And so, no, that's a very poor understanding of Hume. So for me, those things were the things that really helped me get past the whole Pentecostal narrative of persecution, of needing a miracle story to authenticate something, and just getting out of that mindset that says, if I'm being persecuted, then I must be on the right track. No, that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes you're on the right track, and it's because it helps everybody. You got to look at different standards of whether you're on the right track, and this requires you to do a little bit of work. But it's something that really helps you when you really start to think about these things instead of just making stuff up. You get past the making stuff up as a Pentecostal in order to justify your decisions. Well, I took this decision because God seemed to be leading me that direction. And where it becomes as, well, I took this decision because it had this value for me, and this value for other people. It helped other people out. you start to evaluate your actions more on the benefit to yourself and to others instead of whether or not God told you. Okay, and that's a big deconverter idea. You got to look at how you're benefiting others. So I think that's it for this one. If you're a former Pentecostal, I'd love to hear your stories about this passage if you have some. Any other thoughts from anybody else is also welcome. But from my perspective, this is a very interesting passage that's used a lot of different ways. And so I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on it. So thank you very much, and welcome. This has been another episode of Tongues of Fire. So we'll see what you think about it. I want to thank everybody for every like, share, subscribe, for every donation. I want to also, in particular, thank my members. You guys are the thing that makes this thing work. And if you want to join them and become members as well, there's many levels of citizenship in the Rabyd Nation. So just pick your level and give some support. Every member I get makes me think less and less about the YouTube algorithm and more about producing the content that you guys have come to love and enjoy. So consider membership. It's the best way to support the channel, but there's many other ways, from super thanks, chat, PayPal link in the description, things like that. So as well, plus the most basic support is liking the video, putting a comment on it. Always helps the YouTube algorithm notice me just a little bit more. So thank you very much for all that. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So you want to take all your time, money, and opportunities and spend them on yourself, the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.